A few winters back, I was making a long haul across several states, aiming to hit the Pacific Northwest by nightfall. I never bothered reserving rooms ahead of time because I'd always found vacancies along the way. Usually I'd drive until I found a spot that felt right, so I wasn't in a rush. Still, my phone kept pinging with storm warnings about a major front moving into the region I was crossing. Heavy snow combined with brutal wind gusts. I decided to push forward anyway, just keeping my eyes on the sky and the road conditions. Around 5 in the evening, the weather took a sharp turn. It wasn't outright dangerous yet, but I could feel the shift. The forecast had warned this was only the beginning. My car started drifting slightly with each gust. Within half an hour, every other vehicle had vanished from the highway. Just me, alone on a narrow strip of asphalt, buried in a blizzard that seemed to swallow the whole world. When darkness fell, I got genuinely uneasy. I figured I'd better find a place to hole up for the night, but there wasn't much around. The nearest towns were an hour in either direction. A motel 15 minutes down the road had its lights off and doors locked. The only shelter I could find was a small cabin rental just off the highway. The storm erased everything but fear. It didn't look like a proper business, more like someone's forgotten project, but at that point I had no other choice. The listing claimed it was fully bookable online and same-night availability was open, so I reserved it. I drove a short distance, turned onto a gravel lane, and pulled up to the cabin. The online photos only showed the outside, so I knew it was small, but had no idea what waited inside. I grabbed my bag, jogged to the door, and punched the code into a lockbox. Inside, the place was maybe 200 square feet, one open room without even a kitchenette. Not that I needed more than a bed, but something felt off. The interior looked neglected, not vandalized, just untouched, like nobody had rented it in months. Dust coated every surface. The lighting was dim and sickly, making the whole space feel lifeless. I dropped my things near the bed. Barely 2 minutes later, the storm outside seemed to double in fury. I cracked a window. The wind was so violent that even with the outdoor light on, all I saw was white streaks screaming past the glass. It was freezing inside, too. The only heat source appeared to be a tiny wood stove in the corner. Luckily, someone had left a pile of chopped logs. I got a fire going, then stretched out on the bed to rest my eyes. I must have drifted off for an hour or two. I didn't snap awake violently, but something had definitely roused me. A faint noise outside, muffled by the wind and the groaning of the cabin. I got up and moved toward the front door. That's when I recognized the sound, my own car alarm. I threw on my coat and rushed outside. The blizzard had turned the world into a white void. I could barely make out my own vehicle, lights flashing, siren wailing. I hit the unlock button on my key fob, but the alarm kept screaming. I figured the wind had triggered it somehow, but when I opened the driver's door, I saw snow piled on the front seat, like the door had been left ajar for several minutes, except it was shut tight when I approached. I started whipping my head around, straining to see through the storm. Visibility was nearly zero. That's why when I finally spotted a figure, it felt like my heart stopped. A man stood maybe 10 yards away, at the edge of the tree line. I could only see his silhouette through the blowing snow. I tried to yell, but my voice cracked from cold and sheer terror. So I ran back to the cabin and slammed the door. Some shadows don't need darkness to hide. I pressed my face to the window. Nothing, no sign of him following, but I knew he must have gotten into my car somehow. That's what set off the alarm. My mind raced through possibilities. Was he trying to disable my vehicle, trap me here in the middle of nowhere during a blizzard? Every thought made my blood run colder than the storm outside. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The call rang once, twice, then dropped. The storm was murdering what little signal existed this far from civilization. I tried again and again. Once I even heard an operator's voice, but the line cut after a single second. I couldn't tell them anything, couldn't explain where I was or what was happening. Then the car alarm erupted again. I stood frozen inside the cabin, listening to the wail slice through the wind, imagining all the horrible things that might be unfolding just outside my vision. The alarm screamed for several minutes before going silent. I didn't know if he'd shut it off or if my battery had finally died. 10 more minutes crawled by. I kept telling myself maybe he was just a thief rummaging through my car for valuables before disappearing into the night. But then his shape emerged from the whiteout again. He was walking towards the cabin. I backed away from the window. A moment later, his boots hit the wooden porch. He came right up to the front door. He knocked slowly, deliberately, like he knew I was trapped inside and had nowhere to go. I didn't move, didn't breathe. He knocked again. Then I heard his footsteps shift across the porch and into the snow. He was circling to the side window. I pressed myself against the wall, out of sight. His steps stopped right outside the glass. I assumed he was peering in. That's when I heard a low, steady hum. He was humming to himself. He moved from window to window, circling the entire cabin, humming casually as if he were out for a stroll on a summer evening. Every few seconds he'd tap on the glass, never spoke a word, just that eerie melodic sound drifting through the storm. Then, silence. I couldn't tell if he'd walked away or simply stopped humming. All I heard now was the wind. I waited, heart pounding for what felt like an eternity. About 15 minutes later, blue and red lights cut through the snow. An officer had arrived. They'd received my fragmented calls, traced the location, and sent someone for a welfare check. The man outside was gone. Only his footprints remained, circling the cabin, then vanishing straight into the woods. He had no car, he hadn't stolen anything from mine. He'd apparently broken in just to trigger the alarm, to get my attention, to make sure someone was out there. Nothing about it made any sense. I didn't stay another minute. I made it safely to my destination, but I've never booked a remote cabin since. I'd been invited to a mountain cabin by a close buddy named Matt. His family owned a vacation place up in the high country, and they usually visited every winter. But this year, nobody else wanted to go, so Matt asked if I'd join him for a few days of just hanging out. We arrived around noon. I'd never seen the place. It wasn't some tiny rustic shack. This was a proper house, big and modern looking. Matt had been there plenty of times, but never without his parents around. Figuring out how to get everything working took several phone calls back home. By nightfall, we were both exhausted from the 6-hour drive, so we crashed early. When we woke up, the cabin was buried under 6 inches of fresh powder, and snow was still coming down hard. We spent the day inside, watching TV, talking, just enjoying the quiet isolation. That evening, we put on a football game and cracked open a few beers, nothing wild. But at some point, we both heard a sound from outside that was unmistakably a man coughing. We froze, staring at the front door. Matt said there was no way anyone else was out here. After hesitating, I got up and looked out. The porch was empty. We convinced ourselves it must have been a trick of the wind, or maybe we'd had one beer too many. The idea of a stranger wandering around his family's private property in a snowstorm seemed absurd, so we shrugged it off. After the game ended, we hung out by the fireplace, drinking and talking late into the night. I don't even remember what time we finally turned in. Matt took one of the bedrooms. I stayed in the living room on the couch, partly because I wanted to fall asleep next to the fire. Neither of us expected the temperature to drop so drastically. The cabin's regular heating could barely keep the place at 60 degrees. The fireplace made it bearable. I wrapped myself in a blanket and drifted off. I woke up to Matt whispering my name from the hallway. I sat up, groggy and confused. He looked just as disoriented. "Was that you?" he asked. "Was what me?" I said. He told me he'd heard a door open and close. He thought I'd gone outside for some reason, but clearly I hadn't moved. He walked over to the front door and checked it. Still locked. I told him he was probably just anxious, maybe the drinks messing with his head. The cabin was probably just settling. He looked unconvinced, but nodded and headed back to bed. I lay back down and closed my eyes, but now I felt completely awake. I stayed still for 20 minutes, listening to the wind and the house sounds, but everything felt wrong somehow. When I finally sat up to reset, a jolt of ice shot through my veins. The front door was open, just a crack, but it had been locked when Matt checked it minutes ago. I got up and walked over. Freezing air sliced through the gap. I peered outside, nothing but darkness, then closed the door. My heart was hammering. I wanted to wake Matt, but something kept me frozen in place. I stood there, scanning the room, trying to make sense of it. Were we both going crazy? Then I heard a thump against the side of the cabin. I moved toward the sound. Another thump, much louder. It was loud enough to pull Matt out of his room. "What was that?" he asked. I shook my head, then told him about the door. But the thumps kept coming, heavy, brutal hits against the wooden walls, not on the windows or doors, just the walls themselves. There was no chance either of us was going outside to investigate. Not in the dark, not in that storm. We went from window to window, listening. After a few minutes, it went silent again. We sat there for half an hour, debating what the hell could be happening. Neither of us had seen a person outside yet. Our brains were desperate for any other explanation. Then the thumping started again. This time it moved along the side wall, near one of the bedrooms. It wasn't staying in one spot, it was traveling. This went on for hours, brief pauses, then more pounding. Through the entire night, we just sat there, helpless, too terrified to do anything but wait for dawn. Just before sunrise, it stopped for good. When the sun finally came up and the snow began to let up, we grabbed kitchen knives and ventured outside. The outer walls were covered in deep dents, scuffs, and scratches. It didn't look like someone trying to break in. It looked like someone methodically beating the house for no reason at all. We got out of there that morning without a single answer. Looking back, we should have called the police, but we were young and confused and scared. The walls remember what the storm erased. I don't know who or what was in those woods that night, but one thing was clear. They didn't want us there.